I landed my first job this year as a delivery driver for Pizza Hut. At 16, I was only working part-time after school. I chose Pizza Hut because it wasn't too busy, and I wanted a job without too much stress. For the first few months, my shifts were uneventful, mostly blending into a sea of monotonous deliveries. But one Friday night, everything changed. Just before closing, we received an order from a mysterious address. The location was in a part of town I rarely visited, a place marked by its eerie emptiness. The GPS led me through winding streets and unfamiliar turns until it finally indicated I had arrived. The address was at the edge of a darkened park, but there was no sign of life. On one side was a row of decrepit houses, and on the other, an overgrown path leading into the park. The waypoint on the GPS pointed to the path, so I double-checked the address online. It matched, but I was puzzled. I parked my car and took the pizza with me, heading toward the path. As I walked, I realized it wasn't a proper path, but more of a narrow, sinister trail winding deeper into the woods. At the end of the path, I saw a solitary figure on a bench. He looked disheveled and out of place, and his gaze seemed restless. As I approached, he stood up, fumbling with a stained wallet. His behavior was unsettling. He kept muttering, "They're coming, and I have to hide," which made me uneasy. When I got close, the man suddenly fell silent and locked eyes with me. His look was filled with a deep, primal fear. I was about to ask if he was all right when a piercing sound echoed through the night. Someone was screaming. I turned around to see a man in a blood-streaked cloth mask emerging from the shadows, holding a knife. He barked at me to drop everything and get on the ground. I complied in terror, my heart pounding as he threw my belongings aside. The masked man then roughly pushed both me and the frightened man off the path, leading us into the dense, dark woods. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. As we moved further, I could hear strange rustling sounds and whispers that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the other man seized the opportunity and shoved me down, sprinting away into the darkness. The masked man, now visibly enraged, chased after him, leaving me behind. I scrambled to my feet, my breath visible in the cold night air. The woods felt like they were alive, watching me. I ran back to the path, my mind racing with fear. When the police arrived minutes later, they found no trace of either man. The only thing they found was my pizza box, left behind, its contents untouched. I still don't know what the masked man intended, but his actions and the eerie silence that followed his departure make me think something far more sinister was at play. The other man's betrayal was chilling, but it might have been his desperate attempt to save himself, even if it meant abandoning me. In a cruel twist, it was his act of selfishness that inadvertently spared me from whatever grim fate awaited us both. Last fall, as the season was shifting toward winter, the weather took a sharp turn. The cold set in early, and it began snowing heavily in October. I was working late on a food delivery shift, a routine I'd been doing for 3 years. That night, around 10 p.m., the snowfall was relentless. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars navigating the slick roads. Orders were coming in nonstop, and I was exhausted but determined to finish my shift. After several hours of deliveries, I took on one final order. The snow was starting to intensify, and I was beginning to feel the strain. The pickup was from a fast food restaurant, and as I loaded the food into my car, I noticed that the address for delivery was quite a distance away, in an area I wasn't familiar with. It was going to be a long drive back home, considering it was in the opposite direction from where I lived. Navigating through the growing snow, I followed the GPS directions which led me off the main roads and into a more secluded area. The route became increasingly isolated, bordered by thick forest and dim street lights. I eventually reached a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The road was poorly lit and treacherous, but I continued cautiously, hoping the house would soon appear. After what felt like an eternity, I arrived at a dilapidated house partially obscured by the snow. It was a medium-sized old structure, appearing even more eerie under the blanket of snow. I parked and trudged through the thick snow to the front porch. As I approached, I noticed a strange sense of quiet. No sounds from inside, no lights visible through the windows. I knocked on the door, and it creaked open almost immediately. The man who greeted me was unsettling, pale, gaunt, and wearing a heavy winter coat that looked too large for him. His eyes were hollow, and he barely acknowledged my presence. "You can leave the food inside," he said in a flat, emotionless tone, gesturing vaguely towards the darkness beyond the doorway. It was clear I wasn't supposed to enter, but the man's insistence made me uneasy. I hesitated, holding the bag of food, and said,
"I'm sorry, but I really need to get going."
His demeanor shifted abruptly. His eyes narrowed, and a dark expression crossed his face. "You should come in," he said, voice low and unnerving. Before I could react, he slammed the door in my face. Shocked, I quickly placed the bag on the porch and turned to leave. As I reached my car, I heard a faint, metallic scraping sound from around the side of the house. My heart pounded. I glanced back to see the man emerging from the side of the house, his face illuminated by the dim light. He was carrying something long and shiny, what looked like a crowbar. Panic surged through me. I scrambled into my car and started reversing, trying desperately to avoid getting stuck in the thickening snow. The man advanced towards me with unnerving speed, his crowbar swinging menacingly. I managed to get the car moving, speeding away as he watched, his figure fading into the snowy darkness. Shaken, I drove home in a daze, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The unsettling feeling didn't leave me for weeks. Now, I approached deliveries with far more caution, often leaving the food on the porch and leaving immediately. That night, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had ignored my instincts and stepped inside. I worked the night shift at a medium-sized hotel in my town. Most nights, I just stood behind the front counter, attending to the few guests who needed to check in or out. The lobby was usually quiet, especially during bad weather. One stormy night, I was alone at the desk when something strange happened. A man appeared at the entrance, drenched from the rain. He walked through the first set of doors and paused in the small area between the two sets of doors. He peered inside, locking eyes with me for a brief moment before patting his pockets awkwardly and stepping back out into the storm. I figured he must have forgotten something in his car, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor. Minutes later, the phone on my desk rang. The caller ID showed an outside number, indicating it wasn't from any of the rooms. I answered with the usual hotel greeting. A man on the other end claimed he was parked outside and needed help bringing in his luggage. When I suggested he pull his car up to the front, he insisted I come out to assist him, promising it was just a small suitcase. His request felt off, but I reluctantly agreed, telling him to pull up to the front door. I waited by the entrance for a few minutes, growing impatient as the rain continued to pour. Finally, I opened the door and saw the man from earlier, standing in the far corner of the parking lot, waving at me. Why would he want to walk through the storm with his luggage? Ignoring him, I returned to my desk, deciding that if he needed help, he could bring his car closer. Just as I sat down, the man burst through the doors, soaked and breathing heavily. He quickly closed the distance between us, standing too close for comfort. He repeated his request for help with his suitcase, but this time his voice had a desperate edge. I reiterated that he needed to bring his car to the front. He claimed he had already taken the luggage out and didn't want to put it back in. Something was seriously wrong. I asked if he had a room reservation, insisting that I needed to check him in before helping him further. His demeanor shifted from desperate to enraged. He demanded that I assist him immediately, claiming his luggage was getting soaked. Fed up and unnerved, I firmly told him,
If you refuse to check in, I'll have to ask you to leave.
He glared at me before storming out, flipping me off on his way. I watched him through the glass, but he didn't return to a car. Instead, he disappeared into the darkness. Feeling uneasy, I informed the morning crew about the encounter. They reassured me, but the man's behavior haunted me. Later, I discovered that several guests had reported seeing a drenched man wandering the hallways, even though no one matching his description had checked in. The realization hit me hard. He hadn't been trying to lure me outside. He had already found a way inside the hotel, and I had narrowly escaped becoming his next victim.